Okay. Look, we have a nice 50 people there. I suggest we're just going to start. Okay, we have lovely Michelle Barker today. You are, if I'm correct, a lead front-end developer at Atomic Smash. Yeah. You blog at CSS in Life, where you write like lovely things on there. And it's really cool that some people are still blogging, which is really nice. And you also been writing like a lot of articles for example, Smashing Magazine, Web Designer Magazine, CSS Tricks. And you'd love to experiment with new things, such as CSS Custom Properties. So go ahead. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to collect them all, and I'm going to ask them after your talk. So enjoy.
Great. Thank you very much for that lovely intro, Karis. Today, I want to talk about one of my favorite things in CSS, and that's custom properties. I spend a lot of my spare time making demos and tinkering with CSS, and in nearly all my demos, I find myself using custom properties these days. I'm finding new use cases for them all the time, and I have a lot of fun working with them. So I want to share some of those use cases with you today. You may have heard of custom properties referred to as CSS variables because they allow you to store values for reuse in your style sheets. If you're not too familiar with them, this is a quick recap of the syntax. So here we're defining a custom property or variable called primary color on the root element, which is the equivalent to the HTML element, but with higher specificity, making it a global variable that we can use anywhere in our style sheet. And the value of our custom property is deep pink, a CSS named color. And then we can use that custom property inside a selector to apply our predefined value as the background color of this square, say, or anywhere else we might want to use it. And we can also provide a default value if we choose to, in case there's a possibility that we're using a custom property before it's been defined. So if we've previously defined the custom property like we are doing above, then our box is going to be deep pink. But if we haven't defined it yet, then it's going to fall back to dark orchid as the background color. Browsers that don't support custom properties won't recognize that background color as a valid property value. So one way we could handle that is to set a valid background color value higher up in our selector and allow the browser to ignore the second rule if it doesn't support it. So IE 11, for example, doesn't support custom properties. So this box is going to be deep pink, which is our original background color value. But if we don't include a fallback and the browser doesn't support custom properties, then the background color will fall back to its initial value, which is transparent. The default is meaningless if the browser doesn't understand it, which perhaps goes without saying. So our box will be transparent. However, if we have a nice, lovely browser like Chrome or Firefox or pretty much any modern browser which does support custom properties, and you put some kind of nonsensical value in there, like we're doing here, we're using 300 as the default value for the background color variable, which makes no sense as a background color. So this will also fall back to the initial value, even though we've set the background color value higher up in our selector. So again, the element will be transparent. So that's something to watch out for. And of course, we've been able to use variables for quite a long time in Sass and other preprocessor languages. But what makes custom properties different is they're dynamic variables, and they can be updated in CSS and JavaScript. Preprocessor variables are compiled into regular CSS property values before your code hits the browser. The browser will never know what is and isn't a variable, but custom properties are computed in the browser, and that has implications for how we can use them. So let's first of all take a look at a quite simple use case, and that's repeating values, which is perhaps the most obvious use case for custom properties. So anywhere you need to update a value that's repeated throughout your code. And that could be shorthand property values, for example. So suppose you have two elements and they have different top padding values, but they have the same padding for the remaining sides. So the left, right, and bottom padding of both of these elements, both of these selectors will have the same value. And then at different breakpoints, we need to adjust the padding on the three remaining sides identically across both elements. That kind of ends up being quite a lot of code to write. But we could replace those identical values with a custom property. And that way we only need to change one value within our media query and both selectors will be updated. And we can do that for multiple breakpoints if we want to. And it's pretty useful too for vendor prefixes, especially for long values. For example, clip path still needs to be prefixed in some browsers. So instead of setting the clip path value in the property itself and having to remember to update it if we make any kind of change, update it in the regular property and the prefix property, we could set that in a custom property and then we just have one place to make that change. In the example so far, I'm defining the custom property on the root element, so it's a global variable. But you can also scope the custom property to a selector, and we'll look at some reasons to do that a little later on. But defining global variables can be a good idea if they're part of a design system. So if they're global values that we need to use repeatedly across different components and different parts of our design. It's becoming really popular for websites to have a dark theme, and using custom properties makes it quite easy to implement this. So this is how I do it on my own website. I have all my colors set as custom properties in the root element, so they're global variables. And then I use the prefers color scheme media query to redefine those variables for dark mode. And I don't have to change all of them because some of them, like the primary brand color and the header color, will remain the same. So I only have to change these 5 custom properties, and that's my dark mode implemented right across my site. But I do have to be quite careful about naming them. So my instinct is to name variables things like BG light or BG dark for the background color. But of course, when we switch them to dark mode, we don't want a value for BG light that's actually a dark color. That just would not make any sense. So I kind of settled on a naming convention for my own site that works for me. And because I don't have a huge number of properties, it's not a problem. But certainly if you're implementing something like this as a team, it might warrant a bit more discussion over what you name those variables. Another reason for global variables might be in order to maintain vertical rhythm and consistent spacing. So we could set a custom property for one vertical spacing unit, which we're going to call VR, vertical rhythm, and set its value as 2 rems. So these highlighted margins are each one VR unit, so 2 rems in this case. And these spaces are 2 times our vertical spacing unit. So we can use calc for that. And we can implement this quite easily with the lobotomized L selector, which is a term coined by Hayden Pickering, which uses the adjacent sibling combinator. So here we're saying that any element that follows another element should have a standard top margin with a value of 1 VR unit or 2 rems. But for some elements, we can override that and give them a top margin that is a multiple of the VR unit. So here we're saying any H2 that follows an element should have a top margin of 2 times our vertical rhythm unit. So 2 times 2 rems in this case. And perhaps we want that space to scale at different breakpoints. So we give elements a bit more breathing room on larger screens by increasing the white space. So where we're setting that custom property, we could specify that at a certain breakpoint, we want to increase that VR unit across the whole site and just bump it up a little bit. So the large spaces will always be twice the width of the smaller ones, whatever the size of our screens. And we only need that one media query. For even more consistency, if we wanted to, we could abstract that calc value out into another custom property if we find we're using it quite a lot in our code. And we don't need to recalculate that toVR variable in a media query, because that's going to be automatically updated for us because it's calculated using the VR custom property, which we're already updating. So we can calculate custom property values from other custom properties, which can be really useful. One example that has already been written and talked about quite a bit is color. I really like using HSL when I'm working with custom properties, and that stands for Hue Saturation and Lightness. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this one because it's already fairly widely documented, but setting variables for each of the values in HSL gives you a fine degree of control over color. So in this example, I'm using a custom property for the hue value. And I'm setting the hue value as 3 degrees, which corresponds to a red hue. And then I'm setting the second custom property, hue 2, which I'm calculating as the original hue plus 180 degrees. And that corresponds to a hue value from the opposite side of the color wheel. And that's going to give us a complementary color pair. So we could create a bunch of color pairings and adjust them as much as we want just by tweaking one value. The secondary color will always respond and be the exact same number of degrees from the first. We don't need to recalculate that second color each time. So this is in fact a single div CSS illustration of a color wheel, which I made using only CSS iconic gradient in particular, and the mask image property. And it uses custom properties in a similar way to determine the hue value of each segment. So each segment is 30 degrees, which we can set as a custom property. And then each gradient stop is calculated as a multiple of that custom property. So the orange segment is 2 times our original segment value. The yellow segment is 3 times our original segment value, and so on. So what we're doing here is setting custom properties that are relative to one another. And that doesn't have to apply just to color. This is a demo that I made a while ago, which uses 2 clip paths. So with an overlay, you can see those 2 clip paths a bit more easily. The second clip path needs to be offset from the first by the same amount in 2 places. So we have 2 x values for our clip path points that are separated by the same amount at the top and at the bottom. Now, without custom properties, if I update one path, then I have to work out the revised path for the other, which starts to be a little bit of a headache. But we could set some custom properties for those variables. So we're setting variables for the x-axis value for where we want to clip the 2 elements at the top and at the bottom, and the offset value. So that's the distance between the 2 clip paths. And then we can calculate the x value of the second path relative to the first and have that update automatically whenever I adjust one of those x-axis values. And if we want to change the position of the clip path, or if we want to have a bigger gap between them, all we need to do is change the custom property. We don't need to update the clip path property at all. So far, we've talked about using globally scoped custom properties, but in the last couple of examples, you might have noticed that we're scoping them to a selector, and there are plenty of cases when that's more useful. So one reason you might want to do it is to avoid a naming clash, which might mean a selector inadvertently inherits a custom property value you set on an ancestor. Personally, I find it helpful to set custom properties as close as possible to the point I'm using them. So setting a custom property on a selector means it's inherited by its descendants. There are also possible performance issues with using a lot of custom properties on the root element. So updating a custom property will cause a style recalculation of its descendants. So setting them only where you need to use them is preferable. I haven't personally found any major issues with performance and custom properties, but I think if you're setting a lot of them and you're updating them frequently, then that's likely to be where you may get performance issues. So this is an example of a layout class and an example where we are setting a custom property on the selector. So here we're setting a custom property called cols for the number of columns in a grid layout, and then we're updating it within the media query to avoid having to write out the entire grid template columns declaration again. Cols doesn't need to be a global variable because it only applies to our grid. And it means that if we have another layout class somewhere else in our code, then we're free to use that same variable name. I like to use custom properties quite a lot with grid layout. And one reason is because I sometimes work with quite complex grids. And I found that using custom properties can make them more maintainable. So this is a screenshot for a website I worked on a couple of years ago for Warner Brothers Studios. And it was one of the first sites I built with CSS Grid. The design uses several different grids across the site. So these components in particular use a 24-column grid, and there were 9 or 10 different variants with the image and text positioned differently for each one. And with the Firefox Grid Inspector turned on, you can see that 24-column grid. So it was fairly complex to maintain, and this is the code where I'm actually defining that grid with grid template columns and grid template rows. And you can see that code is fairly complex and not all that easy to read. But using custom properties, we can define the important values at the top of the selector and replace some of those values in the property itself. And I find personally that this makes the grid easier to understand for somebody coming into the project new, or if you're coming back to it after a while. The other reason I like to use custom properties with grid is because they have a really similar level of browser support. So it basically means if you're testing for one, you're testing for both. And I can't think of any browsers that support one and not the other, but I could be wrong about that. And we can test for support using feature queries. So this at supports block is basically saying if the browser supports custom properties, execute this code inside the block. Otherwise, it will be ignored. As I touched upon with colors, using calc with custom properties opens up a whole new world of excitement. And one place you can have a lot of fun with them is with staggered animations. So suppose we have a group of elements and we want them to animate in, but we want a slight delay between the start of each element's animation to create a staggered effect. We can use custom properties to achieve this. First, we assign each element a custom property that corresponds to the element's index. We don't need to assign the first one because we can use a default value, which, if you remember, it will fall back to if the variable isn't yet defined. And then we can use calc to calculate the delay between each one and assign it to its own custom property. And we can use that in place of our animation delay value in the shorthand property. If you're working with lists or any kind of UI where you have groups of similar elements, using an element's index as a custom property can be really handy. Just to digress from the animation angle for a moment, we can use a similar technique to visualize progress, which is something I did on a recent project. I needed to build a UI with a series of steps showing the customer journey, and at the top of each step is a little bar to indicate the step's position relative to the total number of steps. So if you're on step 5 out of 10, the little progress bar will be 50% filled. I gave each list item a custom property that corresponds to its index in the list. And the whole list has a custom property that corresponds to the length of the list, or the number of items. And in this case, I'm setting those custom properties in the HTML rather than in the CSS. And the advantage of that is if you're using a templating language, you can set the custom property within the loop. If you're looping over the items, you can use the loop index. I use Twig most of the time at work, but most templating languages will give you a way to do this. There are different ways you could style up that progress bar, but the way I'm doing it is by using a linear gradient background with hard color stops. In the CSS, I calculated the gradient stop as a percentage using the length and the item index custom properties. So this is step 2 out of 5, so that progress bar is 2/5 filled. Armed with a custom property value that matches the element's index, we can get even more creative, especially with text. So in order to implement a staggered animation for a string of text, we need to wrap each individual letter in a span and assign it a custom property, which, if we prefer, we can do in the HTML itself again. And then we can implement the animation in exactly the same way as before, by calculating the delay variable. In this case, the keyframe animation is animating the font weight of a variable font. There are accessibility implications of wrapping each letter in a span, as some screen readers won't read that H1 as a whole word, and instead they'll announce every letter individually. So you need to make sure you account for that, which you can do by using aria label or aria labeled by, or a visually hidden element with the original text. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each approach. Now, if you feel like setting custom properties on every single element could get a little laborious, then there's a JS library called SplittingJS that does the work for you. And that's in fact what I used for the variable font demo. And it's pretty much my favorite JS library for using in demos. It provides you with a custom property for the length of the text string too. So let's look at a few examples of how we can use these. I really love playing around with CSS Motion Path. The Motion Path specification enables us to place elements on a path and to animate them along that path. Just a quick warning, first of all, there is quite a lot of motion in the next section. So if you're somebody who suffers from sickness or vestibular disorders, you might want to skip this part or proceed with caution. So using Motion Path, we first of all need two properties. Offset path defines our path, and offset distance specifies how far along the path to place an element. For offset path, we give it a path value similar to SVG path syntax. And that's how I get my paths. I draw them as SVGs in Illustrator or a similar graphics program, and then copy the resulting value. An offset distance value of 0 would place an element at the start of the path. And then we can animate the offset distance property value. So if we move it to 100%, that's going to move it to the end of our path, which we're doing in this keyframe animation. So that's going to give us this little ball sliding up and down the curve. So it's a fairly simple animation, but kind of cool that we can do that just with CSS. Now the name Motion Path is a little misleading as it doesn't necessarily have to relate to motion. We can position stationary elements along the path if we choose to. If we want to position several elements equidistantly along the path, then custom properties are great for that. Again, we're calculating the offset distance value of each element using the element's index as a custom property. And we can even do it with text. This works best with uppercase text, a monospace font, or a font where each character has a very similar width. Otherwise, the spacing gets kind of weird. And if we want to get even more clever about it, we could ensure that our text is always positioned along the full length of the path by calculating the position of each character based on the custom property that corresponds to the length of the text string. Again, SplittingJS provides us with that, with this custom property. So we could position our text around a circle using offset path, for instance. And we could, of course, position text around a circle using transforms, but the difference here is the text remains selectable, which is pretty cool. So we're dividing the path by the length, by the number of characters plus 1, which is in case we want a space after our text ends. And that gives us the offset value for each character. And we're multiplying that by the character index and using it in the offset distance property. So that way, even if we change the length of our text, it will still fit the circle. So that's a static text example, but we can, of course, animate our text along the path too. So here, our keyframe animation is moving each character along 12 rems from its original position, which is calculated with the custom property, which gives us this result. So that's okay, but it's not terribly exciting. But we could also add a small delay to each character using the same technique as the staggered animation before. And that gives our animation a much more fluid, organic feel, which I think looks a lot nicer. And of course, we can get even more creative with our paths and the properties we animate. But this demo is using exactly the same techniques as before, nothing more advanced than that. We just have a slightly more complex path, and I'm also additionally animating the color of the text. And this one is pretty similar too, but with the addition of a 3D transform. But you can get pretty complex with custom properties if you want to and calculate a bunch of things. So in the following demo, I have these 12 custom properties, some of which are calculated from others. So this is one of the more complex demos. And those custom properties are computing the values for delay, color, 3D transform rotation value, the position along the path or the offset distance, and the animation duration of each of those individual segments. So there's really no limit to how creative you can get if you use your imagination and if you like doing maths, which apparently I do. We can also manipulate custom properties with JavaScript. So this is a tool I built for generating zigzag gradient backgrounds. And whenever the user moves one of these sliders, it changes one of the custom properties, which I'm using to set the thickness of the stripes, the angle, and the width of the zigzags, and the color too. But for some reason, I haven't included that in the video. Although we can use animation, we can't use animations and transitions on CSS gradients, we can transition custom properties using Houdini, which is a set of APIs that allows developers to extend CSS. So I register the property in JavaScript and then transition it just like any other CSS property, which makes the whole thing feel just a little bit smoother. So that's another bonus that you get with custom properties, although it's not supported in all browsers at the moment. So to demonstrate how to set custom properties in JavaScript, this is a simple demo that uses custom properties that correspond to the Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio. So we can use element.style.setProperty to set them with JavaScript. So in a for each loop, I'm setting a custom property on each item, which uses the elements index. I'm using that to calculate the color. And another custom property for the corresponding value in Fibonacci sequence, which calculates the width of each item. So I hope this has given you a bit of a glimpse into custom properties and left you feeling a little bit inspired to play around with them and build some fun things. If you'd like more resources, Leah Veru recently wrote a really great introduction to custom properties. Una Kravitz has a good write-up of using HSL and custom properties for color theming. And I've written about some of the techniques used here on my blog, CSS in Real Life. Thank you for listening. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm at Mishbarks and at CSS in Real Life. Thank you very much.
That was really nice. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Karis.
It's like everybody's just really excited. It's really fun to see.
I haven't looked at it this whole time. Now I'm looking.
Oh, only good stuff.
Okay. Did I really speed through that? I don't even know how much time I took.
I think you're
cool. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask?
Yeah, there are a few questions on the. Okay, let's see. Asked how it's supported in browsers, but I guess you already said something about it, right? But can you tell us a bit more about it?
Sure. So basically, all modern browsers support custom properties. The main reason why I don't use them much more than I do is because certainly in my job, we still need to support IE 11, which is the millstone around my neck. I actually use some custom properties, but the main area one of the main areas that it would be really useful is for theming. But unfortunately, that tends to be the thing that you cannot compromise on with clients. Like they want their brand theme, and if you say to them, oh, actually, it's not going to be in IE 11 for this percentage of users, like no, I need my. Yeah. So that's kind of stops me using them a little bit more than I do. But I know you can polyfill them. I'm not a huge fan of chucking in loads of polyfills for features, but that is one option. And most of the time I use at supports, like if it's something where the custom property just makes the experience better and the IE experience is good enough, then that usually works for me.
Yeah, I totally get that. Callum asks, where do you land on using custom properties with media queries? Because he says, I have been doing this with a custom CSS plugin, and it feels right, but not part.
What do you mean specifically? Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sorry, let me just read the question again. Where do you land on using custom properties with media queries? I have been doing this with a post. It feels right, but not part of the spec.
Oh, you mean like actually using a custom property for the media query itself, like as your like breakpoint value or something?
Or maybe just using them in the media queries. Let's see if you can.
Yeah, I can see somebody's put it in the chat. Yeah, that's I would like to be able to do that, but yeah, that's not. I mean, I didn't actually know that you could do that with Post CSS, so that's kind of cool. I might look into that. But yeah, it's not part of the specs. So it's not something I do. I think it would be quite useful. The one thing that I think that I would really love with custom properties or just generally with CSS is to be able to get that element index custom property, like as if it was something is like an nth child, then you'll have access to that nth number, like whatever it is, as a custom property somehow. I'd love for that to be like part of the spec.
Yeah.
To manually set it on each element, either in CSS or in your HTML. There is a proposal. I guess you call it a proposal. It's for something really similar, and it's not quite counters and it's not quite custom properties, but it's like it's kind of like having a counter value, but like one that would correspond to the elements index. And also, I think Adam Argyle proposed it, and so it would be like element index or like or element count or something like that.
As in like counting up like a JavaScript, for example. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So not in JavaScript, but like something.
Yeah.
You have access to that value without having to manually set it.
So
that would completely like negate the need for splitting JS, for example, where you would just have value in CSS. So that's my dream. I mean, I think that's a long way.
Let's see, what else do I have? Also, everybody would just love to see your slides as well. So if you would like to share them with us, then I'm just gonna make sure I'm gonna put them in the Google Doc, and then everybody can see them.
Yeah.
Let's see. Is there anything? Oh yeah. Also, everybody wants you to do a workshop, so that's really wonderful. So maybe we should talk about that. Nicholas asks, as a developer who works with non-coder designers, what's the best way to explain the benefits of custom properties when it comes to color?
Interesting. Yeah, so that's a difficult one because in my experience, certainly, like designers are not using HSL values, say, and you could use RGB or RGBA, which might be a bit closer to like possibly the colors that designers are working with. Yeah, I don't really know what the answer is to that. It's not something that I've gone into with the designers where I work, but it's something that I would like to kind of explore a bit more. I think the main reason that I haven't gone into that is because in my daily job, I don't tend to use custom properties for the theming side of things. Yeah, so I don't really have a good answer for that. Is the short answer. Sorry.
I think we will forgive you. Let me see if there are any other questions.
So actually, one.
Everybody just.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So one thing.
Go ahead.
Like with color, it's really similar to what you can kind of already do with Sass, using like the lighten and darken functions. Except it's just in native CSS. So if designers like kind of understand that, like and if you have designs where you have like your button styles or whatever, and then your hover states are like 20% darker or something like that, then being able to do that with custom properties is maybe an advantage, and that's something that they might kind of understand a bit more. I don't know.
Yeah, and having it kind of make it like part of like a design system.
Yeah,
I think that's got to do with like the whole design system approach, is having like reusing your colors and just using colors, I guess, right? Like,
yeah. So at work, we use Tailwind CSS. Yeah, the utility class library, and I think so one thing that the designers kind of get from that is that you have like these multiple color values, which are like blue 500, blue 600, blue 700. So like different gradations of your color. Again, that's something you could potentially do with custom properties.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
It was really great. It was also full with examples. Please share the slides with us.
I will.
And see you around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. And thank you.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.